At 2:40 in the morning, I stood in the doorway of my mother's guest room and watched a woman I had never seen before sleeping in my mother's sheets. My mother had been dead for 5 months. The woman's left hand lay on top of the quilt. On her third finger was my mother's ring, rose gold, worn thin on the palm side, the way a band only gets after 50-some years of dishwater and garden dirt and holding somebody's hand in church. I bent close enough to catch the hall light on the inside of that band. There was a date engraved in there. It was not my parents' wedding date. It wasn't any date I had ever heard of in my life. And downstairs on the kitchen counter, there was a stack of mail sitting under the sugar bowl, with her name on it. My name is Del Prentice. I'm 55 years old, and I fix watches for a living. Prentice Watch and Clock, 214 Delaware Avenue, right between a tax office and a place that sells vacuum bags. My father opened it in 1971, and I took the bench when he died in 2004, and in all that time we have never once moved the sign. Here's what nobody understands about my job. People think I fix time. I don't. I find lies. A man walks in with his grandfather's watch and tells me it's untouched, original, never been apart. I put a 10-power loop in my eye, and inside of 90 seconds I can tell him the crown was replaced in the 80s. The dial was reloomed by somebody with a shaky hand, and 2 of the 4 case screws don't match the other 2. I always tell them gently, that's the part I learned from my father. A man named Rudy Salas brought me a 1974 Psycho last spring, said his dad wore it in the mill for 30 years. The crown was a swap. I told him the truth, and then I told him something else that was also true, that the watch had been worn every single day since, and you could see it in the wear on the lugs. He cried a little in my shop, and I let him. That's the trade. And engraving. Engraving is the loudest liar there is. A hand-cut engraving from 1968 has a burr on it, a little rough shoulder where the graver walked. A modern recut is clean, even machine steady. You can lay them side by side under the loop, and it's like comparing handwriting to a typewriter. I mention all of that now, up front, so you understand something about the woman asleep in that guest room. She was not the first person to think I wouldn't notice. My mother was Arlene Prentice. She lived her whole married life at 104 Belclair Street. Yellow brick, aluminum awnings that rattled in a hard rain, a crabapple tree in the front yard that dropped fruit all over the walk and that she refused to let anybody cut down. She kept a coffee can of loose buttons in the hall closet. She kept every church bulletin from 1979 forward. She was not sentimental about people exactly. She was sentimental about proof. She died on the 9th of November in the recliner with the television on and a crossword folded on the arm. Congestive heart failure, 84 years old. My sister found her the next morning. I got the call at 6:15 and I remember I set down the movement I was holding, very carefully in a plastic tray, because my hands already knew what my head hadn't caught up to yet. My sister is Corinne. She's 51, sells real estate out of a storefront across from the courthouse, drives a white Acura she washes twice a week. Corinne is the one who talks at family things. I'm the one who stands by the food table and counts the seconds of a silence. That's a habit of mine. It came off the bench. You listen to a movement, and you count the beat, and after 30 years you can't stop doing it in a room full of people. When somebody takes too long to answer a simple question, I know exactly how long. 22 seconds is a very long time to stand in a kitchen waiting for your sister to tell you where a ring is. Because that's how this actually started. Not at 2:40 in the morning. It started in January on a Sunday in that same kitchen when I asked Corinne one question. Mom's ring. Where was it? 22 seconds. Then she said, it's in the safe deposit box with everything else, Del. Warren has the inventory. Don't make this a thing. Warren Tidwell is the family attorney. Tidwell and Rask, second floor above the pharmacy, same firm that did my father's estate. Corinne was named executor in Mom's will, which surprised nobody, including me. She's the organized one. I fix watches and keep yellow carbon copies of every work ticket since 1998 in shoeboxes by year in the back room, which my sister has called, out loud, at Thanksgiving, the hoarder closet. Real quick, if this story's already got its hooks in you, hit subscribe and drop a like. It costs you 2 seconds and it helps me more than you know. Anyway, Warren had the inventory. I never saw the inventory. The porch light is what did it. I'd been going by the house 2-3 nights a week, boxing things up, and every single time I left, I killed that porch light and locked the side door. My mother's rule. She used to say a light left on is a light you're paying for. So, on the third Tuesday in April, when I drove past at 9 at night and saw that light burning, my stomach dropped about an inch and stayed there. I told myself I'd forgotten. People forget. Then Gwen Tolliver called me. Gwen is 78, lives directly across the street, has lived there since 1981, and she does not call anybody after 9 o'clock unless something is genuinely wrong. She called me at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning. She said, "Del, honey, I don't want to be the nosy one, but there's been a car in your mother's driveway every night for 2 weeks. Silver. And the upstairs light goes off around 11. I asked her how long. She said she'd started writing it down. Of course she had. Gwen and my mother came from the same generation of women who wrote everything down. I got dressed in the dark. 22 minutes across town, empty streets, one light at Delaware and 9th that's been blinking yellow since 2019. There was a silver Corolla in the driveway with a parking hang tag from a hospital system 3 counties over. I put my hand on the hood and it was cold. It had been there a long while. The side door was locked. I used my own key. The house smelled wrong. Not bad, wrong. Somebody else's laundry soap. There was a dish towel on the oven handle that my mother never owned, and a phone charger plugged into the outlet by the toaster, and a pair of white sneakers set neatly on the mat by the door, toes to the wall, the way you do when you plan on staying. The stairs in that house have a bad 4th step. I've known about it since I was 9. I stepped over it. And that's how I ended up in the doorway of my mother's guest room at 2:40 in the morning, looking at a stranger asleep in my mother's bed with my mother's ring on her hand. I should tell you what I did next, because I think most people would have done something else. I didn't wake her. I didn't yell. I stood there and I counted. She was maybe 60. Silver at the temples, the rest still dark, braided back the way a woman does when she's going to sleep in a bed that isn't hers. There was a paperback on the nightstand with a library sticker on the spine. A glass of water. A pill organizer, Sunday through Saturday, and the little Wednesday door was already open for the morning. That pill organizer is what stopped me from calling the police right that second. Thieves don't unpack. Thieves don't set out tomorrow's blood pressure medication. So I lifted her hand 1 inch off the quilt and turned the band until the lamplight caught the inside of it. And there it was, engraved in a clean, even, machine-steady line. A month, a day, and a year. My parents were married on June the 14th, 1968. I have seen the inside of that ring 100 times. I saw it every Sunday of my childhood when my mother folded her hands on the pew in front of me. The date in that band was March the 11th, 2024. And it had been cut recently. The walls of it were too crisp, the edges too sharp, no 70 years of skin oil rounding them off. A date is just a number, until you know what happened on it. I went downstairs, quiet, over the 4th step, and into the kitchen where my mother made 200 Thanksgivings. There was the mail under the sugar bowl. 4 envelopes. A pharmacy circular, a phone bill, something from a credit union, and one from Tidwell and Rask, 2nd floor above the pharmacy. Every single one of them was addressed to a woman named Nadine Croft. At 1804 Belle Claire Street. That's when my phone lit up in my hand. 2:52 in the morning. My sister lives 40 minutes from that house, and Corinne has gone to bed at 9:30 every night since she was a teenager. The text said, "Everything okay at the house?" I looked up, and above the porch light, screwed into my mother's siding, there was a small white camera that had absolutely not been there in November. I did not answer that text. I stood in my mother's kitchen with the phone in my hand and I counted, the way I always do, and by the time I got to 60, I understood exactly what that little white camera was. It wasn't there for burglars. A camera like that pings a phone the second something moves in front of it, which meant somebody's phone had lit up at 2:40 in the morning when a 55-year-old man walked up the side steps of a house he owned half of. So I ran a test. I reached over and flipped the porch light off. Waited. Flipped it back on. 91 seconds later, my phone buzzed again. Dill. Are you there right now? Then I put the phone face down on the counter and I sat in my father's chair at that kitchen table and I waited for morning. 4 hours? I've spent longer than that on a broken chronograph. Waiting is the one thing I'm actually good at. Around 5:40, I heard the fourth step creak and a woman's voice from the hallway said, "You must be Dell." She was in a gray cardigan with the sleeves pushed up and she had already made the bed. 60 years old, give or take. Silver at the temples, the rest still dark. Reading glasses pushed up on her head. She did not scream, she did not run, and she did not act one bit surprised to find a strange man sitting in the dark of her kitchen. She said, "I'd been expecting you for about 6 weeks." Her name was Nadine Croft. She sat down across from me and she put her hands flat on the table and I watched my mother's ring catch the light over the sink. "Look, I want to be honest with you about something." I had driven across town at 2 a.m, ready to hate whoever was in that bed. And inside of 4 minutes, I couldn't manage it. She had that steady, low way of talking that people get when they've spent 30 years around folks who are frightened. She told me she was a retired home health aide. 29 years, hospice and post-surgical, mostly nights. She told me she'd taken early retirement in 2022 when her husband Ray got sick, and that Ray passed in September of 2023, and that between the last 11 months of him and what the insurance decided not to cover, she came out the other side $61,000 underwater at the age of 59. And then she told me she now worked for something called an estate companion service. $900 a week, paid every Friday, plus utilities. Her entire job was to sleep in that house. Not clean it. Not sort it. Sleep in it every night and leave the porch light on and take in the mail addressed to her and change nothing. I asked her who hired her. She looked me right in the eye and said, "Corinne Prentice. Your sister." She was very clear that you knew. Something didn't add up, and it hadn't for a while, but that was the first sentence that put a name to it. Here's what I want you to understand about Nadine Croft. She had a folder. She went and got it out of her tote bag and slid it across the table to me without me even asking. A signed service agreement, an emailed schedule, 3 pay stubs, and a laminated card with an agency's name on it. She wasn't hiding a thing. Whatever this was, she believed it was legal, and she had the paperwork of somebody who has been poor enough, recently enough, to keep every receipt. I recognized that instinct. I've got a backroom full of it. So I asked her the only question I actually cared about. I pointed at her left hand and I said, "Mom, where did you get that ring?" And that steady woman, who had just handed a total stranger her own pay stubs at 6 a.m, went completely quiet. 31 seconds. I counted every one of them. Then she said, "It was given to me," and that was all she said. Not by who. Not when. She turned her hand over and closed her fingers around it like it was a coal she was carrying, and I understood I was not going to get another word out of her about it that morning. A woman will hand you her financial ruin on a piece of paper and go silent about a ring. That tells you the ring is the thing. Real quick, if you're hooked on this, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and give it a like. It genuinely helps this story reach more people. I left at 7. I didn't threaten her, I didn't put her out on the street, and I didn't call anybody. I drove to the shop, unlocked the front door at 7:40 like I have every weekday since 2004, and then I did the thing that my sister has been laughing about at family dinners for 20 years. I opened a work ticket. Yellow carbon, 3-part, same pad my father used. Customer line, item line, date received, notes. I've got shoe boxes of them by year going back to 1998. Corinne calls that back room the hoarder closet. On the customer line, I wrote, Arlene Prentice. On the item line, I wrote, 1 rose gold band, ladies, worn. Interior engraving 311D 2024. Not original. And then I started doing to my mother's estate exactly what I do to a watch somebody swears has never been apart. You start with the case, you look for tool marks, You find the places where somebody's hand has been that shouldn't have been. The first tool, Mark, was easy. County probate records are public in this state, and you can pull the whole docket off the clerk's website for free if you know the case number, which was on that letter from Tidwell and Rask that I had photographed on the counter at 3 in the morning. Estate of Arlene M. Prentice. Filed November 26. Corinne D. Prentice, executor. And underneath that, a list of every document filed in the case since. 14 filings. 13 of them were exactly what you'd expect. The 14th was called an Affidavit of Continuous Occupancy and Care, filed on the 8th of March. I had never heard of it. I had never seen it. And I am the other heir. Before I go on, I want to hear from you. If you found a stranger living in your late mother's house and your own sister put her there, what would you have done that morning? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I paid $4.80 to download the PDF. It came through while I was fitting a new mainspring into a mantel clock, and I let it sit there on the screen for a minute because I already had a bad feeling in the back of my throat. 2 pages. Plain language. It swore under oath that the property at 104 Belclair Street had been continuously occupied and maintained without interruption by a resident caretaker, and that the residence had at no point stood vacant since the decedent's passing. And it gave a start date for that occupancy. February the 2nd. Nadine Croft did not sleep one night in that house before the 28th of March. She told me that herself, at that table, with her pay stubs sitting in front of me, first check, the Friday of that week. $6,100 worth of stubs on the table, and not one of them older than 5 weeks. Somebody had sworn under oath to a date that was 7.5 weeks early. And I knew, personally, that the house was empty on February the 2nd. Because on February the 2nd I was in it, alone, until almost 11 at night, taking the storm windows off the back porch and boxing up my mother's church bulletins. I scrolled down to the signature page. There were 2 lines on it. My sister had signed the first one, and when I saw whose name was under the second, the one witnessing that this was all true and correct, I set the loop down on the bench and I sat there for a long, long time. Because I had heard that woman sing at my mother's funeral. Renata Salas, notary and paralegal, Tidwell and Rask, 2nd floor above the pharmacy. Commission number printed right under her signature, sharp and legible, like she had no reason on God's earth to think anybody would ever look at it. She sang at my mother's service. Second song, after the reading. She stood up in a navy dress with a hymnal she never once opened and sang, in the garden all the way through without a microphone, and I watched a room full of 80-year-old women reach for their purses to find a tissue. My mother had asked for that specific song. Renata had known her since Renata was a teenager, because Renata's mother and my mother had cleaned that same church together for 11 years. I sat at my bench with a mantel clock half apart in front of me and I did the arithmetic. My mother buried in November. That woman's name on a false oath in March. 4 months. And here's the part I keep coming back to. She's the notary. Notaries are the whole point. A notary is the person who stands there and says, I watched this get signed and I checked who signed it. And that's it. That's the entire job. It's a little tiny piece of machinery that the whole rest of the courthouse depends on. To be honest, the same way a watch depends on one jewel the size of a grain of sand. When that one piece lies, every single thing downstream of it is wrong and nobody can see it from the outside. Now, I want to be careful here because at that moment I still didn't know what any of it was. FOR. House sitter and a wrong date on an affidavit. And that's it. That's all I had. I did not have a motive, and I did not have a crime, and I sure did not have a reason yet. So, I did what I do. I stopped guessing and I started measuring. If you're still with me and you're enjoying this, a like and a subscribe would honestly mean a lot to me. 3 things I could actually check. 1. What that affidavit was attached to. 2. Why anybody would need the house occupied instead of just owned. 3. That date inside the ring. The docket answered the first one for free. That affidavit hadn't been filed on its own. It came in as an exhibit to a petition. And the petition was a request to have the residence classified as occupied homestead property for purposes of the final estate accounting, filed by counsel for the executor, with a hearing date set on the estate calendar for the 30th. The 30th. 11 days out from the morning I was reading it. I'm not a lawyer. I'll say that plain. So I did the same thing I do when a customer brings me a movement I've never seen. I went and found somebody who'd already taken one apart. Her name is Marguerite Odom, 68, retired title examiner, 31 years at the county recorder's office, and for the last 9 years she has brought me her late husband's Belova every March for a service it does not need. I have never once charged her for it. We both know what the appointment is actually for. I called her at 2 in the afternoon and read her the caption of the petition over the phone. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Del, read me the exhibit list again." And when I did, she said, "Somebody's not trying to prove the house is worth something. Somebody's trying to prove it isn't available." I asked her what that meant. She said, "Honey, in 31 years, the only people who ever cared this much about who's sleeping in a house are people getting divorced." I sat down on the stool by the bench. Corinne has been married to Peter Mackey for 19 years. Sells commercial HVAC systems, big handshake, plays golf badly and loudly. Last Thanksgiving, he stood in my mother's kitchen and told me the shop should have gone digital in 2010 and then laughed like he'd done me a favor. Nobody had told me they were splitting up. Nobody tells me anything. I'm the brother who stands by the food table. But Marguerite told me where to look, and county civil filings are public in this state too. It took me 9 minutes. Mackey v. Mackey. Filed the 12th of January. Contained. And attached to it, a standing court order that any marital asset acquired during the marriage had to be disclosed and appraised before division. My mother died on the 9th of November. Corinne filed for divorce on the 12th of January. 9 weeks. And here's the thing that put the whole gear train together in my head. An inheritance in this state is not marital property. It belongs to the person who inherits it. Her husband's attorney couldn't touch a dollar of it. Unless she couldn't inherit it clean. And she couldn't, because the house was left to both of us. Which meant, in a divorce accounting, my sister's share of 1104 Belclair was a number. A ligaway number. Half of a house that appraises around $290,000. And a number is the easiest thing in the world for an opposing attorney to find and split. But a house that is continuously occupied, that has a caretaker in residence and can't be listed or sold, isn't a number. It's a problem. It sits in a footnote. It gets valued as encumbered, if it gets valued at all. And a hearing on the 30th would put a court stamp on that footnote before Peter Mackey's attorney ever finished discovery. $900 a week for a woman to sleep in my mother's bed, against $145,000. I want to tell you I felt rage right then. I didn't. What I felt was something closer to grief, honestly, because I finally understood that my sister had done arithmetic with our mother's house, and I was one of the variables. I still had nothing but public documents and a retired title examiner's hunch. So I went looking for the villain's own words. Now, I did not hack anything. I want to be extremely clear about that, because everything I did after this only worked because I kept my hands clean. I filed a written demand as a beneficiary for a full accounting of the estate, every disbursement, every invoice, every dollar the executor had paid out of estate funds. That's my legal right. I sent it certified mail to Tidwell and Rusk on a Thursday, and I paid the $7.90 for the green card. Then I went back to the third thing on my list. March the 11th, 2024. My mother's church bulletins. Everyone since 1979, in the boxes I packed on February the 2nd, the night the house was supposedly occupied. 9 boxes in my back room. I started at the top. March the 10th, 2024. Second Sunday of Lent. And down in the corner, in the prayer list, in my mother's own blue ballpoint, she had circled a name and written beside it, Warren 2's 9 a.m. Ring the folder. Tuesday was March the 11th, and Warren Tidwell's office is the second floor above the pharmacy. I sat on the floor of the hoarder closet with that bulletin in my hand, and I thought about a woman 84 years old who never learned to drive on the highway, getting somebody to take her downtown on a Tuesday morning in March with a folder. 8 months before she died, and she'd had that date cut into her own wedding ring. Then the certified mail came back. Not a rejection, not a letter from Warren. It came back with a phone call from my sister at 9:40 at night, and the first thing she said to me, before hello, was, "What exactly do you think you're doing, Del?" I let it sit for a second. Then I told her the truth. I said I'd filed a beneficiary request for an accounting, which is a thing I'm entitled to do, and that I'd like to see the inventory Warren has had since November. She said, "You're going to blow up something you don't understand." I asked her to explain it to me then. And she did this thing she's done since she was 15 years old, where her voice drops half an octave and gets very reasonable, and she said, "Del, there's a woman in the house because an empty house gets vandalized." That's it. That's the whole thing. You want to make it into a conspiracy because you've got nothing else going on. 12 seconds of nothing. I counted. Then I said, "Corinne, the affidavit says February the 2nd. I was in that house on February the 2nd until 11 at night taking storm windows off the back porch. There was nobody there." And my sister, who had just told me the whole thing was about vandalism, said, "That's a clerical thing." Or Renata typed it. It's being corrected. I never said the word affidavit to her before that call. I never said Renata's name. I asked about an inventory. I said okay, and I said goodnight, and I hung up, and then I sat in my kitchen for a while with my hands flat on the table. Because here's what actually hurt. It wasn't the lie. It was that she'd had an answer ready. You don't have an answer ready for a document nobody's supposed to know about unless you've already imagined the conversation where somebody found it. My sister had rehearsed a conversation with me. In her head. Ahead of time. That's a lonelier thing than being stolen from. The accounting came 8 days later. Not from Corinne. From Warren Tidwell's office, in a manila envelope, because a beneficiary demand in writing is a beneficiary demand in writing, and Warren Tidwell has practiced law in this county since 1988 and was not about to sit on one. 41 pages. And I want to say something about Warren here because it matters later. Warren is 71, keeps a cardigan on the back of his chair, and did my father's estate in 2004 without charging my mother for the phone calls. Every disbursement was listed. Utilities. Lawn service. $211 for a gutter repair. And then 9 entries, 1 per week, every Friday, occupancy services. Belclair, $900 Exide. Paid to Meridian Estate Care, LLC. $8,100 of my mother's estate money. Out of the account that was half mine. And on page 38, buried in the vendor documentation, was an invoice from Meridian Estate Care with an email chain printed on the back of it. Green messages. Somebody had stapled the wrong side up. The last message on that chain was from my sister's address, sent on the 24th of March at 4:01 in the afternoon, and it said 7 words. She just needs to be sleeping there before the 30th. I read it maybe 40 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because of the word just. That's a small word. That's the word you use when you're trying to make a thing sound smaller than it is, even in a private email, even to a vendor, even when nobody's watching. My sister was managing her own conscience and writing. And the reply under it, from a Meridian scheduler, said, "Understood. We can have someone in place by the 28th. Please confirm the start date you want reflected in the service record." The start date you want reflected. Not the start date. The one you want. I made 3 copies. One for the shoebox, one for the safe at the shop, and one that stayed in my truck. Quick word. If this story's keeping you up, subscribe and give it a like. That's the only thing that keeps stories like this one going. Now, here's where I have to tell you what I did not do, because I think it's the whole reason this ended the way it did. I did not send that email to Peter Mackey's attorney. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. 1 envelope, no return address, and my sister's divorce would have turned into a fire she couldn't put out. I thought about it for 2 nights. Then I thought about my mother, who kept every church bulletin since 1979 and never once used a single one to hurt anybody. So instead, I did the boring thing. I took it to Warren Tidwell in person on a Thursday morning, and I put the 41 pages on his desk with page 38 turned face up. Warren read it. He put on his glasses and he read it twice, and then he said something I have thought about ever since. He said, "Dell, whose commission number is on that affidavit." And I watched a 71-year-old man realize that the woman who sat 40 feet from his door had used his firm's notary seal on a false oath. Warren didn't yell. He picked up his phone and he called the firm's malpractice carrier before he called anybody else, which is the single most lawyer thing I have ever seen a human being do. Then he told me he was withdrawing as counsel for the executor, and that he'd be making a report to the Secretary of State's Notary Division, and that he could not advise me because I was now, in his words, an adverse beneficiary. Then he took his glasses off and said, off the record, "Your mother came to see me in the spring of 2024. I asked him about what? And Warren Tidwell, who cannot tell me what's in a client file, said, I can tell you she came in twice. And I can tell you the second time, she took something with her when she left." Before I go on, what would you have done with that email? Sent it straight to the husband's attorney and let it burn, or done what I did? Tell me honestly in the comments. I want to know if I got this wrong. The hearing was 6 days out, and on the Monday before it, Renata Salas walked into my shop. Navy dress? Same one, I think. She stood at the counter where customers stand, and she didn't look at the watches at all. She said, "Warren put me on leave." I asked her if she wanted to sit down. He said no. Then she stood there and told me a thing I did not expect, which is that her daughter is 32 and has multiple sclerosis and lost her job in 2023 and has been living in Renata's back bedroom since, and that Corinne Prentice had sold Renata's house in 2019 and waived her entire commission when the deal nearly fell apart, and had never once mentioned it again in 6 years. She said she never asked me for a thing until March. And when she did, it sounded like a favor. I asked her what she thought she was signing. And she said, quiet, a date. That's all. It was one date on one line. Then she reached into her purse and she put a photograph on my counter, face down. She said, "Your mother gave me this the week before she passed." She said, "If a day ever came where I couldn't look you in the eye, I should give it to you and tell you where she kept things." I turned it over. It was my mother, standing in front of the crabapple tree, holding a manila folder against her chest with both arms. And written on the back, in blue ballpoint, in her handwriting, "Not with Warren. Ask the one who sings." I looked up from that photograph, and Renata Salas was already crying, standing straight up at my counter with her hands at her sides like she'd been waiting 5 months for somebody to hand her a sentence she could stand inside of. She said, "I didn't know it meant me." I swear to you, Dell. I thought she meant the church choir. I thought she meant Loretta or one of the Burn girls. I asked her what my mother actually said to her that week. And Renata said, "Renata, honey, you sing at everybody's funeral in this town. You're going to sing at mine." And she put that picture in my hand and she said, "Hold on to this. Don't put it anywhere clever. Don't put it anywhere clever." My mother, who kept her buttons in a coffee can and her bulletins in cardboard boxes and never once in her life owned a filing cabinet. I asked Renata one more question. I asked her if my mother had said anything else. She said, she asked me if I still had the key to my mother's old lockbox at First Delaware Credit Union. The little one. She said she'd always liked that bank because they still had a person at the window. First Delaware Credit Union. There had been an envelope from a credit union on that kitchen counter at 3 a.m, under the sugar bowl, addressed to Nadine Croft. Except it wasn't addressed to Nadine Croft. I'd assumed. I'd stood there at 3 a.m. with my heart going, and I'd read 4 envelopes, and my brain had painted the same name across all of them. I keep photographs of everything. Habit off the bench. You photograph a movement before you touch it, so you know what it looked like before you were ever in there. I pulled up the picture from that night, zoomed in, and the credit union envelope said, Arlene M. Prentice. Annual box rental notice. Box 204. 214, same as the shop. My father's address, since 1971, she'd have picked that number on purpose, and she'd have thought it was funny, and she'd never have told a living soul. If you're still here, and if this is landing for you, hit subscribe and drop a like. Truly, it's the whole reason I keep telling these. Now I have to slow down and tell you the ugly part, because I could not get into that box. Renata's key opened her own mother's box, not my mother's. And I was not the executor. Corinne was, under a court appointment that was still, at that moment, completely valid. So, on the 28th, I walked into First Delaware Credit Union, and a woman named Priya at the desk was as kind as she could possibly be while telling me no. Death certificate wasn't enough. Being a named heir wasn't enough. She needed letters, testamentary, or a court order. I stood in a credit union lobby at 55 years old holding my mother's death certificate and a photograph of her under a crabapple tree, and I got told no by a very nice woman doing her job exactly right. The hearing was in 2 days. And whatever was in that box, I had no way to get to it before my sister stood up in front of a judge. So I did the only thing left. I filed a beneficiary objection to the petition. 6 pages, typed on the shop computer, printed at the library because my printer's been out of cyan since Easter. I attached the docket copy of the affidavit the accounting warrants office had sent me, page 38 face up, and a 2-paragraph statement of what I personally did on February the 2nd, 2025, between 5 and 11 p.m., including the receipt from Hollyfield Hardware for storm window clips, 1427, time-stamped 5:52 p.m. I keep every receipt. My sister has laughed about that at 3 Thanksgivings. I filed it at the clerk's window on the 29th at 4 Town in the afternoon and paid the filing fee in cash. The hearing was at 9 the next morning, courtroom 3B, county courthouse, across the street from my sister's storefront. I want to tell you what that room is actually like, because television gets it wrong. It's got fluorescent lights and a radiator that clanks. There were 11 other estates on the docket that morning, and most of them took 4 minutes each. Nobody's crying. Nobody's shouting. It's paperwork with a bailiff. Corinne came in at 5 to 9 in a charcoal suit with her hair done. She had a new attorney, a young man from a firm 2 counties over with a rolling case file. She saw me in the 3rd row, and she did not look surprised, and she did not look away either. She sat down and she said, quietly, without turning her head, "You couldn't just let me have one thing." I said, "That house was Mom's." And she said, "And I was the one in it every Tuesday for 6 years, Dell." Every Tuesday? Where were you? Here's the thing about that. She wasn't wrong. She was there on Tuesdays. She took Mom to the podiatrist and the pharmacy, and she sat through the same 4 stories about the crabapple tree. I fixed the storm door and the disposal, and I called on Sundays, and I told myself that was even. It wasn't even. It was just quieter. Then the judge called the case, and here's where I have to tell you it looked like she was going to win. Her new attorney stood up and did a very smooth thing. He conceded the affidavit right out of the gate. He said the occupancy start date had been entered in error by clerical staff, that a corrected affidavit had been filed that morning with the accurate date of March 28th, and that the petitioner was withdrawing the earlier document entirely and apologized to the court. Then he said the petition for occupied homestead classification still stood on its own because the house was, as of that morning, continuously occupied and maintained and had been for 33 consecutive days. And the judge looked at my objection and looked at the corrected filing and said the thing I did not see coming. He said, "Mr. Problem? Prentice, your objection is largely mooted by the correction. Do you have anything beyond the date?" I stood up in a courtroom in a shirt I ironed at 6 in the morning, and I said, "No, Your Honor. Not today." He set the classification hearing over for a ruling on the 11th and told the parties to submit the appraisal. And that was it. 4 minutes, like all the others. Corinne's attorney was already zipping the file. I walked out into the hallway and I stood by the water fountain and I counted to 120, and I understood that being right is not the same as being able to prove it. And then, at the end of that hallway, coming out of the clerk's office with a folder under her arm, was Nadine Croft. She saw me. She stopped, and she said, "Mr. Prentice, I quit on Tuesday, and I need to tell you what your mother said to me in 2019. I said 29th. She told me she'd never met my mother. She'd said it at that kitchen table with her pay stubs between us. And Nadine Croft said, I lied to you. It was the only thing I lied about, and I've been sick over it since." We went down to the vending machines on the first floor, the little alcove with 2 plastic chairs bolted to the wall, and she sat with that folder flat on her knees and told me. In 2019, she was still working nights. Post-surgical home care 11 months for a woman named Arlene Prentice who'd had a hip replaced at 80 and refused to go to rehab because she wouldn't leave the crabapple tree unwatched. I never knew. I paid for that care. I never once asked the name of the woman who came at night. Nadine said my mother taught her to play gin rummy at 2 in the morning and beat her 91 games out of 140. She said my mother talked about her son, the watchmaker, and her daughter, the realtor, and that she had a way of describing both of us that was completely fair and not entirely kind. Then Nadine said, in November, an agency called me about a house sit. $900 a week. And when they gave me the address, I sat down on my kitchen floor. She took the job because she was $61,000 underwater and because she recognized the address. And on her second night in that house, she found something. Not hidden. That's the part that stopped me. My mother did not hide it. It was in the coffee can of loose buttons in the hall closet. Down at the bottom, under 50 years of buttons in a small Ziploc bag, the ring, and a key with a paper tag, and a folded index card. Nadine said, your mother told me in 2019 that if I ever came back to that house for the wrong reasons, I'd find something in the buttons. I asked her what the index card said. She opened the folder on her knees and handed it to me. My mother's blue ballpoint. Polar lines. The ring is for whoever is sleeping in my house and shouldn't be. Wear it so my son sees it. He'll know the date is wrong. He's the only one who ever looks. I sat in a plastic chair bolted to a courthouse wall, and I could not get a breath in for about 10 seconds. She left it as a signal. Not a will, not a warning, not a letter to a lawyer. My mother, 84 years old, who never learned to drive on the highway, designed a message that would only work if it passed through a watchmaker's loop. She knew her daughter would put somebody in that house. She knew her son would notice a recut engraving. A date is just a number until you know what happened on it. I asked Nadine why she wore it, why she didn't just call me in December. And she said, because I needed the $900 a week. And I told myself, as long as it was on my hand where he can see it, I haven't done anything wrong yet. She looked at the vending machine and she said, I gave myself 5 months of that. Then she turned the key over so I could read the paper tag. First Delaware Credit Union, Box 214. And underneath it in the folder was a consent for access form, signed and dated the 4th of April, 2024 by Arlene M. Prentice, naming a co-deputy on that box. Not an executor. A deputy on the account with independent access effective immediately and surviving death. The name on it was Nadine Croft. My mother had put her on that box in 2024, 5 years after gin rummy, 2 months before she ever knew she was sick. Priya at First Delaware took 11 minutes. She checked the signature card, she checked Nadine's license, and she walked us both back and left us alone in a room with a table and a chair and a box the size of a bread pan. Real quick, and then I'll finish. If you've made it this far with me, hit subscribe and give it a like. It means everything. Inside was a single envelope. A holographic will. That's a will written entirely in the testator's own hand, which is valid in this state, dated March the 11th, 2024, signed and witnessed by 2 people. One of them was Marguerite Odom. The other was a notary from a credit union branch, not from any law firm. Warren had drafted the first will. My mother went to see him twice in the spring of 2024, and the second time she took something with her when she left. She took her own file. Then she went and wrote a new one herself, in her own handwriting, and put it somewhere nobody would think to ask, because the whole architecture of the thing was built to survive the exact person who'd know where to look for it. The new will left the house at 104 Belclair Street to me. Outright. Not split. And there was a second page. My mother explaining herself, which she never did in life. She wrote that Corinne had asked her, in February of 2024, to put the house in Corinne's name alone. To protect it, Corinne said. My mother wrote she was already afraid of Peter then. She didn't tell me that part. She told me it was about taxes. I have known that girl since before she had a face, and I know when she's frightened and lying at the same time. Then the last two lines. Del, I did not do this to punish her. I did it because a house she takes from you will never be hers. Give her something. Just don't let her take it. I filed it on the 2nd. Marguerite came in and testified to her own signature in about 90 seconds. Here's what happened after, and none of it was me. The corrected affidavit was the thing that finished my sister. Because filing a correction is an admission that the first one was false, and a false notarized oath doesn't get cured by a do-over. The Secretary of State's Notary Division took Renata Salas's commission and referred it out. 31 years of a paralegal career, gone over one date on one line for a woman who'd waived a commission for her in 2019. Renata sent me a card in June. 3 sentences. She's doing medical billing from home now, so she can be there for her daughter. She still sings at funerals. Nobody asked her to stop. And Corinne's own filing did the rest. Everything she put in front of that probate court was public. Her husband's attorney found the whole docket in about 4 days. The petition, the affidavit, the correction, the $8,100 of estate money spent to manufacture an occupancy. He didn't just take the house share. He used it. A woman who moves assets during a contested divorce doesn't get believed about anything else, and she didn't. The chickens came home to roost, and she'd built the coop herself. She lost the house because the second will meant she never had it. She lost her credibility because of the way she tried to hide something she'd already lost. Warren Tidwell retired in July. He told me on the phone that he'd had a notary in his office for 19 years and never once checked a single one of her journals. He said it in the voice of a man who was going to think about that for the rest of his life. I saw Corinne in October. She asked to meet at the diner on Route 7, and she was there first, in a booth, no makeup, drinking coffee she didn't want. She said, "Are you going to say it?" I said, "Say what?" And she said that I did it to myself. I didn't say it. She already knew, and there's no version of a man saying that out loud that makes him bigger. I said, "You were there on Tuesdays. 6 years of Tuesdays. That was real, and I never gave you credit for it, and I should have." She put her hand over her mouth, and she sat there for a while. Then I took the ring out of my shirt pocket and I set it on the table between the sugar caddy and the napkins. She looked at it like it might bite her. She said, "You know what that is." I said, "I know exactly what it is. It's the day she stopped trusting you." And I said she wore it anyway. Every day for 8 months, right up until the 9th of November. That date was on her hand at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, and every Tuesday you drove her to the podiatrist, and she never once said a word about it. I said, "That's not a receipt, Corinne. That's a woman who wrote down what happened and kept loving you at the same time. She was capable of both. I'm still working on it." My sister cried in a diner booth on Route 7 with her hands in her lap. I told her the ring was hers if she wanted it. Not the house. Not the money. That's gone. And it went to her husband's attorney and her own attorney and the county. Just the ring. She hasn't taken it yet. It's been 10 months. It sits in a plastic tray on my bench at the shop, in a second drawer, under a yellow carbon work ticket that says Arlene Prentice, 1 rose gold band, ladies, worn. Interior engraving, 3/11/2000-2024. Not original. I never wrote a completion date on that ticket. Some jobs you leave open. I live at 1824 Belclair now. The crabapple tree still drops fruit all over the walk, and I still won't cut it down. Gwen Tolliver comes over on Sundays and beats me at gin rummy, which is apparently something the women on that street have always been able to do. Nadine Croft got a job at the credit union. Priya put in a word. And she comes by every March with a watch that doesn't need servicing, same as Marguerite. I've got 2 standing appointments now that aren't really appointments. And the porch light goes off every night at 11 because a light left on is a light you're paying for. A date is just a number until you know what happened on it. My mother knew that. She'd known it for a year and a half, and she carried it on her hand where anybody could have seen it, and only one person ever looked. If this story stayed with you, and you'd like to hear more true-to-life stories of secrets and quiet justice, tap the video on your screen now. I'll be waiting for you there.